Lydia counted out the coins into her mother's palm without looking up. "That should be enough to get you settled," she said, and clicked the reins. Beatrice grabbed the side of the wagon. "Lydia, wait. What are you—" "Don't make a scene, Mama. People are watching." "You said we were stopping for water." "We did stop." Lydia still wouldn't look at her. "Get down, please." "Lydia." "Mama." The word came out flat and final, the way you speak to someone whose time you have already spent. "Get down." Beatrice got down. She stood in the dust of Red Hollow's main road with $3.14 in her palm and watched her only daughter drive away without once looking back. She had given that woman 30 years of her life. 30 years. And Lydia had spent 43 seconds saying goodbye. If that opening broke something in your chest, you are exactly who this story was written for. Subscribe to this channel and follow Beatrice all the way to the end, because I promise you this woman is not finished. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The coins were still in her palm when the wagon disappeared. Beatrice Holloway did not run after it. She did not call out her daughter's name. She did not allow her knees to do what they wanted to do, which was buckle. She stood at the edge of the Red Hollow trading post with her worn leather bag pressed against her hip, and she looked at the place where Lydia's wagon had been until the prairie dust closed over it, like water closing over a stone, and then there was nothing left to look at. $3.14. She counted it once. Then she closed her fist around it. Behind her, the trading post door opened. A man came out, said something to another man, laughed at something, went on his way. A woman in a blue calico dress walked past on the opposite side of the road and glanced at her, and then glanced away. A horse tied to the post near the entrance shifted its weight and exhaled. The world went right on moving. Beatrice stood still in the middle of it and breathed. She was 57 years old. She was a large woman, broad across the shoulders, full in the hips, built the way women are built when they have spent 3 decades doing the labor of 2 people and eating whatever was left after everyone else was fed. Her gray-streaked hair was pinned back in the way she had always worn it. Neat. Practical. No pretense about it. She had a face people called kind when they were being generous. She had a face people called plain when they were not. It did not matter now either way. There was no one here who knew her face. She looked down at the coins in her hand. Then she tucked them into her coat pocket, picked up her bag, and walked to the wooden bench along the front wall of the trading post, and sat down, because her legs had been standing since before sunrise, and she did not have a destination yet, and there was no dignity in wandering in circles. She needed to think. The thinking was this: she had $3.14. A boarding house in a frontier town in 1878 ran somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a night. A meal was another 15 to 20 cents. She could not stretch $3 past a week, and at the end of that week she would still be in Red Hollow, Montana, a town where she knew no one, and no one knew her, with no work, no references, no family, and no plan. She had never in her life been without a plan. That was the thing pressing down on her chest. Not the money. Not even Lydia. Not yet. Not fully. Because she had not let herself think about Lydia directly since the wagon pulled away, and she did not intend to start now, not in public, not on a bench in a strange town. She had walls built against that particular grief, and they would hold because they had to hold. But the plan. The absence of a plan. That was new territory, and it frightened her in a way she would not have admitted to a living soul. She had raised Lydia alone. Thomas had been thrown from a horse when Lydia was 9. She had buried him in early November, grieved him through one winter, because that was the time she could afford, and then stood up in the spring and figured out what surviving looked like for a woman with a child and a small Missouri farm and no backup. She had taken in laundry. She had sold eggs and garden produce. She had mended clothes for the neighbors at 10 cents apiece. She had worked herself to the outer edge of what a body could endure for years without complaint, because Lydia was watching, and Beatrice understood that what a child sees her mother do in the hard times is what that child will know how to do for the rest of her life. She wanted Lydia to know how to stand up. She had not counted on Lydia learning a different lesson entirely. When Lydia married Gerald Ashford, sharp-minded, cold-eyed Gerald, who wore his ambition on the outside like a second coat, Beatrice had told herself that it was fine, that Lydia was happy, that the way Gerald looked through her when she spoke was just his manner and not his meaning. She had followed them to Kansas City and then further west because Lydia had asked, and because being near her daughter was worth the disruption, and because she had told herself for years, she had told herself that the life she had given Lydia was still connected to her, somehow that she was still part of it. She had spent the last 3 years getting smaller, not in body, in all the other ways. Eating faster so she took up less time at the table. Speaking less so she took up less space in the conversation. Apologizing for the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. She had watched herself disappear piece by piece, and had kept telling herself it was temporary, that Lydia would come around, that what they had been to each other in those hard Missouri years would mean something eventually. "This is your stop, Mama. I left some coins in the bag." She pressed her hand flat against the outside of her coat pocket where the coins were. She would not think about Lydia. Not right now. Right now, she needed a plan. A woman came out of the trading post and paused at the sight of her. She was perhaps 40 with an efficient face and a no-nonsense apron, and she was carrying a wrapped parcel under one arm. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. Cautious, not unkind. "No, ma'am," Beatrice said. "Just resting." The woman looked at the bag, looked at the hour, looked at the particular quality of stillness that a person has when resting, and the particular quality they have when stranded, and apparently read the difference correctly. "You have somewhere for tonight." A beat. One beat too long. "I'm working on it," Beatrice said. The woman's mouth pressed flat. "Boarding house on Mercer Street takes women travelers," she said. "Left at the farrier right at the church. Tell them Martha sent you." A pause. "It ain't free." "I didn't expect it would be," Beatrice said. "Thank you, Martha." The woman went back inside. Beatrice sat a moment longer. Then she stood up, squared her shoulders, picked up her bag. She had taken exactly 4 steps when the trading post door opened again, and a man walked out with 2 grain sacks on his shoulders like they cost him nothing. He was not what anyone would call remarkable. Middle 30s, lean the way outdoor men get lean. His hat was pushed back. His boots were worn at the heel. His clothes were clean, but patched in 2 places, the stitching visible and making no apology for itself. He was not a man of means. That was plain before he opened his mouth. He set the grain sacks in the back of an old wagon, straightened up, looked across the road, the way a man looks when he is checking the weather, and then his eyes landed on her. He did not glance away. He looked at her the way people rarely did, directly, without the careful choreography of pretending not to notice. He took in the bag in her hand, and the direction she had come from, and the direction she was going, and his eyes were quiet and level and entirely without pity. Pity she had been steeling herself for. Pity she knew how to refuse. This was something else, and she couldn't name it fast enough to defend against it. "Evening, ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Evening," she said, and kept walking. "You know where Mercer Street is?" She stopped, turned back. "Someone said 6 blocks east." "Left at the farrier right at the church," he said. "You got someone meeting you there?" "No," she said. "I don't." He nodded, slow, not rushing his judgment. "I saw you sitting earlier," he said. "Saw the wagon leave." The heat came up in her face before she could stop it. "Then you saw more than I'd have liked." "Probably." He agreed without apology and without making more of it than it was. He turned back to the wagon, picked up the second grain sack. "That your daughter's rig?" She held very still. It was. He set the sack down. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, plain as the boots on his feet. No theater to it, no performance of sympathy. Just a man who meant what he said and had nothing to gain from saying it. She almost kept walking. Every sensible instinct in her was pointed at Mercer Street. But something about those 2 words, the simplicity of them, the complete absence of expectation, held her half a step longer than she intended. "Do you know of anyone hiring?" she asked. "Honest work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I've done all three my whole life. He looked at her directly. You any good at it? I kept a farm running 18 years after my husband died, she said. Make your own judgment. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. More like a door opening a careful inch. My name's Caleb Whitaker, he said. I got a small ranch about 4 miles out, struggling if I'm being straight with you. He looked at the wagon a moment. House hasn't been properly kept since my wife passed. Cooking's a sorry state of affairs. No money to pay what decent help deserves. He looked back at her. But I got a room going empty, and food enough for 2, and I don't cheat the people I make agreements with. Beatrice studied him the way she had spent 30 years learning to study people. The worn boots, the honest stitching, the direct eyes. The way he was standing, not leaning forward, not performing generosity, not angling for her gratitude. Just a man stating the facts of his situation and letting her decide. You don't know anything about me, she said. No, ma'am. I'm 57 years old. I can see that. And I will not, she said word by word, and steady as stone, be anyone's charity. Not for any reason. Not in any form. I wouldn't offer you any. What you're describing is a job. Yes, ma'am, a job. She looked toward Mercer Street. 6 blocks east, $3.14. A week, maybe less. She looked back at Caleb Whitaker. I have one condition, she said. Name it. I keep my own counsel, she said. My past is mine. I don't answer to anyone about where I came from or what happened to me. Fair enough, he said without hesitation. Mine is too. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. All right, Mr. Whitaker, she said. We have an arrangement. Caleb, he said, picking up the reins. Nobody calls me Mr. Whitaker except men I owe money to. She walked to the wagon. He waited while she climbed up without offering to help exactly what she needed, and she settled her bag in her lap, and he clicked the horse forward. They pulled out of Red Hollow in the last of the evening light heading west. She did not look back. She had looked back enough today. He had not exaggerated about the ranch. It was small, and it was struggling, and it showed every one of the 4 years since someone had last cared for it properly. The kitchen floor was the color of old hopelessness. The curtains were torn in 3 places. The garden beds along the south wall were half wild, the good plants tangled up with the bad. The pantry was the particular kind of sparse that came not from one bad week, but from a long, slow slide of a man feeding himself just enough to keep working. Caleb lit the lamp and showed her the room, small cedar, smelling a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot of it, a window facing east. It ain't much, he said. It has a roof and a door that closes, Beatrice said. It's sufficient. He left her to it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let the silence of the house settle around her. Outside, she could hear him moving through the barn, the sounds of a man finishing his evening work, unhurried, methodical. She opened her bag and found the Bible at the bottom of it. Cracked spine, cover worn smooth. She had carried it since her wedding day, and when Lydia was born, she had written her daughter's name in the front of it, in her own careful hand, the way mothers do. As if writing a child's name inside the book you love most is a way of saying you are mine and I am yours and this is permanent. She pressed her palm against the cover, held it there. Then she set it on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, and she lay down, and when sleep came, it was deep and without dreaming. She was up before the sun. She did not know this kitchen. So she opened every cabinet in order catalogued. What was there? What was missing? What could work and what could not? By the time Caleb came in from the morning feed, there was hot coffee on the table and cornbread coming out of the oven, made from the last of the cornmeal she'd found in a half-empty sack near the back of the lowest shelf. He stopped in the doorway. You didn't have to. It's what you hired me for, she said. Sit down. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at the bread, and then at her with an expression she hadn't expected, and didn't immediately know what to do with. I don't know when the last time was, he said, that someone cooked in this kitchen. I could tell, she said. There's no flour left. I'll need provisions if I'm going to do this properly. Do you have an account at the trading post? I do. Then give me a list of what you can afford, and I'll work from it. He ate without speaking. 2 pieces of the bread, the whole cup of coffee. Set the cup down. I should tell you, he said, that people in Red Hollow talk. People everywhere talk. About this specifically, he said. A man living alone, a woman in the house. Caleb. She refilled his cup without being asked. I am 57 years old. I have survived a widowing, 2 hard winters, and my own daughter leaving me at a trading post with $3. I am past the age where other people's opinions of my choices determine what I do. He was quiet for a moment. All right then, he said. All right, she agreed and went back to the stove. The first week was work, which was the only rhythm she had ever fully trusted. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until the wood showed color again. She mended the curtains with thread from a sewing tin she found at the back of a closet. She cleaned out the root cellar, sorted what had gone past from what could still be used, and made a list of what needed replacing. She planted 3 rows of kitchen herbs in the patch behind the house. With the best light, there was still enough summer left for them to take hold. She cooked real meals, not a man's idea of keeping himself alive, but actual food beans, slow-cooked with salt pork, cornbread with a crust worth biting through, beef stew with the root vegetables she found half wild in the abandoned garden beds. Caleb ate everything she put in front of him, said little, but she noticed he started coming in from the range a few minutes earlier each evening. She noticed he stopped putting his coffee cup away between uses the way a man does when he has started to think of a place as somewhere he will return to. Small things. She was good at small things. On Friday of the first week, she asked to see the ranch ledger. He hesitated. Men always hesitated about that. I'm not being nosy, she said. I managed the books on our farm for 18 years. If I'm going to help this place run properly, I need to know what I'm working with. He looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then he got up, went to the back room, and came back with a battered leather ledger that had clearly not been opened in months. He set it on the table and sat back down and watched her face the way a man watches when he is deciding whether to be relieved or embarrassed. She read it in 20 minutes. You're not insolvent, she said. He exhaled. But you're not far from it. She turned a page. You're paying cash for things you could be trading. You're buying feed at the worst possible time of season. And whatever price you agreed to with the Ferris brothers for your cattle is too low by at least 20%. He set his cup down. How do you know what the Ferris brothers are paying? I overheard 2 men at the trading post the evening I arrived, she said. I paid attention. She closed the ledger. I always pay attention. He rubbed the back of his neck with the expression of a man who had suspected something and was now being shown the proof of it. What would you do? He said. Fix the feed timing first, she said. Then find someone other than the Ferris brothers to sell to. He nodded slowly. Looked at her the way he was starting to look at her, like he was revising something. You're not what I expected, he said. You expected an old woman who could cook. I expected someone who needed help, he said quietly. Not defensive, just honest. I do need help, she said. I also know things. The 2 aren't exclusive. Something in his face shifted. Just barely. Just enough to see if you were paying attention. She was always paying attention. The second week, Red Hollow started talking. She had known it would. She had told him she was past caring, and she was in every way that counted. But there is a difference between being unmoved by what people say and being unaware of it, and Beatrice had always been too honest with herself to pretend those were the same thing. At the general store. The women near the yard, goods went quiet when she walked in. The proprietor's wife leaned toward her neighbor. The man behind the counter was briefly uncertain about being pleasant. She was pleasant enough for both of them. Stated her order. Paid what was owed. Left. On her way back to the wagon, a woman called out from across the road. You're the woman staying at the Whitaker place. Not a question. Beatrice turned. The woman was perhaps 50, well-dressed by Red Hollow standards, with the expression of someone who had appointed herself an authority on matters of community propriety. I work at the Whitaker Ranch, Beatrice said. I manage the house. By yourself. The eyebrows went up with precisely the implication intended. Mr. Whitaker runs the cattle operation, Beatrice said. I run the household. The same arrangement half the ranches in this county have with hired help. An arrangement, the woman repeated. A working arrangement. Beatrice held her gaze. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. The woman's mouth tightened. You're not from here, she said, as if this settled something. No, ma'am, Beatrice agreed pleasantly. I'm not. She picked up her goods and walked to the wagon. Her hands were not entirely steady as she climbed up, and she sat for a moment before taking the reins, looking at the weathered main street of Red Hollow, feeling the familiar hollow pressure of a place that had already decided what it thought of her. She knew this feeling. She had known it her whole life. The particular exclusion that doesn't slam a door, but simply fails to open one. She had felt it after Thomas died, when the neighbors were kind for one season and then retreated back into their paired lives. She had felt it in Lydia's house, eating faster, speaking less, apologizing for the sound of her footsteps. She had felt it on a bench outside this trading post while an entire town walked past and chose not to see her. She knew what it meant to be invisible. She had never once stopped getting up in the morning. She snapped the reins and drove back to the ranch with her spine straight and her eyes on the road ahead. She was reorganizing the back room late on a Thursday evening, a cluttered space that had served as a combination storage and failed office, when the small wooden box slid off the top shelf, along with a stack of old cattlemen's journals, and hit the floor with a sound that made her go still. Plain pine. Simple latch. Not locked. She hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside one woman's glove, left hand kidskin small. A folded piece of paper. A pressed flower gone nearly colorless with age. She did not read the paper. She folded it exactly as it had been put, the glove and flower back, latched the box, and went to find Caleb in the barn. This belongs to you, she said, and held it out. He looked at it. His face moved through something she watched without making obvious that she was watching. Where was it? He said. Back room, top shelf. It fell. He took the box, held it in both hands, didn't open it. My wife, he said. I thought it might be, Beatrice said. I didn't read the paper. He looked up at her. Most people would have, he said. I'm not most people, she said simply. He looked back down at the box. A long silence settled in the barn, and Beatrice stood at the door and did not move and did not fill it. Clara, he said finally. Fever took her in 4 days, spring of 74. A pause. I never could work out what to do with her things, so I just put them away, Beatrice said. Yeah, that's what you do, she said, until you're ready. He looked at her. Are you ever ready? She thought about the Bible on the windowsill. Lydia's name in the front of it written in her own hand 30 years ago. I don't know, she said honestly, but you keep going regardless. He nodded once, tucked the box carefully under his arm. Thank you, he said, for not reading it. You don't have to thank me for that. I know, he said. I wanted to anyway. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when she overheard Mrs. Calhoun. She was on the far side of a shelving unit in the dry goods store, and Mrs. Calhoun, the innkeeper's wife, a woman whose sense of public virtue appeared to be her primary occupation, was speaking to a customer in the carrying voice of someone who has never had reason to worry about who was listening. A shame really what some women will do for a roof over their head. And at her age, you'd think she'd have more dignity than to... Beatrice stepped around the end of the aisle. Mrs. Calhoun saw her. Went the color of old chalk. The customer found somewhere else to be. Beatrice looked at Mrs. Calhoun and let the silence run for 3 full seconds. Mrs. Calhoun, she said. The woman lifted her chin. I have worked every day of my life, Beatrice said. Her voice was level and unhurried, and she did not raise it once. I have never been kept by anyone. I am working for Mr. Whitaker the same way hired help works anywhere in this territory. When you suggest otherwise, you are not protecting this town's character. You are simply being unkind to a person you have never spoken to. She paused. I'm not asking you to welcome me. I am asking you to have the basic decency not to lie about someone you don't know. That's all." She picked up her goods and walked out before Mrs. Calhoun could find her voice. Outside, her heart was hammering hard against her ribs. She pressed one hand flat against the wagon and breathed until it steadied. Then she climbed up. Then she drove. It occurred to her somewhere on the road back that she would not have said any of that 6 months ago. In Lydia's house, she had swallowed those words 100 times. The cost of saying them had always felt too high. She was not in that house anymore. Something in her had been waking up slowly, quietly, since the moment the wagon disappeared into the prairie dust and left her standing with $3.14 and no plan. She did not know yet what to call it. But it felt unmistakably, and for the first time in a very long time, like herself. Caleb was at the corral fence when she pulled in. He walked over while she was climbing down. "I heard about the store," he said. "News travels fast in a small town." "It does." He took the horse's bridle. "I should have gone with you." She stopped, looked at him. "So you could fight my battles. So you wouldn't have been alone in there." She held his gaze. He said it quietly, without theater, and he meant it. She could read that plainly. He was not offering to protect her. He was saying something different, something she did not have a ready response for. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I have been alone for a very long time," she said. "I know how to manage it." "I know you do," he said. "That's not what I'm talking about." She looked at him for a long moment. At the worn hat and the honest face and the way he was standing, not pressing forward, not asking for anything, just saying what was true. "All right," she said quietly. He nodded, put his hat back on, went back to his work. She stood by the wagon for a moment after he left, not moving. She had sat on that bench outside the trading post 3 weeks ago and believed in the plainest and most practical part of herself that her life was essentially finished, that she had given everything she had to give, and what remained was just the time left over. She looked at the ranch, the herbs coming up in the south bed, the kitchen curtains she had mended, and rehung the lamplight already warming the window from inside. She had been wrong. She was only beginning to understand the full size of how wrong. And somewhere behind the window, the coffee would still be warm, and tomorrow there was work to do, and for the first time in years, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, that felt like something worth waking up for. The herbs came up on a Tuesday. Beatrice noticed them first thing in the morning. 3 thin rows of green pushing through the dry Montana soil, small and determined, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone believed they would make it. She stood over them for a moment with her coffee cup in her hand and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still tight. Then she went inside and started breakfast because there was work to do, and sentiment was something you could afford after the work was finished. Caleb came in from his morning feed and stopped when he saw the plate waiting for him. Eggs, fried bread, the last of the salt pork she had been rationing through the week. "You didn't have to use the pork," he said. "You've been up since 4 doing the heavy work," she said. "You need more than coffee and cornbread." He sat down, picked up his fork, then set it back down and looked at her. "Beatrice," he said. She was at the stove with her back to him. "Eat before it goes cold. The Ferris brothers are coming this afternoon." She turned around. "You set up a meeting," she said. "They sent word yesterday. They want to renegotiate the fall contract." He looked at his plate. "I was going to handle it alone." "And now?" He looked up. "I'd like you to be there." She studied him for a moment. 3 weeks ago, this man had been a stranger with a beat-up wagon and 2 grain sacks. Now he was asking her to sit across from his business partners and be present for a negotiation that would determine whether this ranch made it through the winter. "All right," she said. "I'll be there." "You don't have to say anything." "I know," she said. "But I might anyway." Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. "Almost. That's what I figured," he said, and picked up his fork. The Ferris brothers arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which told Beatrice something right away. Men who come to renegotiate at 2 o'clock are men who have had a long lunch and feel comfortable. Comfortable men in a negotiation are men who believe they already know how it ends. There were two of them. Dale Ferris was the older one, heavy-set with a practiced friendliness that lived only on the surface of his face, the kind of smile that had been useful so long it had forgotten it was a performance. His brother Roy was leaner, quieter, and watched everything from a slight distance the way a man does when his job is to notice what his partner misses. They came into the kitchen and stopped when they saw Beatrice standing at the counter. Dale Ferris looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "This is Beatrice Holloway. She manages the ranch." Dale looked back at Beatrice. His smile adjusted itself by a small deliberate degree. "Ma'am," he said and touched his hat. Didn't know Caleb had brought on help. "He mentioned the same thing about you," Beatrice said pleasantly. "Sit down, gentlemen. The coffee's fresh." Roy Ferris sat down without a word. Dale took another moment recalibrating. Then he sat too. Caleb poured. Beatrice leaned against the counter with her own cup and said nothing, because she had learned long ago that the person who speaks first in a negotiation is usually the person who needs something. Dale Ferris needed something. She could tell by the way he opened, too warm, too generous with his compliments about the spread, too quick to reference his long relationship with Caleb and how much he valued it. Men who value a relationship don't lead with how much they value it unless they are about to do something to compromise it. The thing is, Caleb, Dale said, finally wrapping his hands around the coffee cup in the manner of a man arriving at his point. The market's shifted. Prices are down across the board. We're barely covering our own costs right now. He shook his head sorrowfully. We're going to need to come in lower on the fall contract. I hate to say it, but there it is. Caleb said nothing. He looked at Dale Ferris, and he waited. Beatrice said, "How much lower?" Dale looked at her. Roy looked at her. The air in the kitchen changed temperature by several degrees. "Beg pardon," Dale said. "You said lower," Beatrice said. "How much lower are you proposing?" Dale's practiced smile held, but something behind it recalculated. "Well, ma'am, this is really between—" "I manage this ranch," Beatrice said. "That includes the accounts. So I'm asking how much lower." Dale named a figure. Beatrice set her coffee cup down on the counter without a sound. She looked at the figure, the way you look at something that has just confirmed exactly what you suspected. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "I happened to be at the trading post 3 weeks ago when two men were discussing the current cattle market. The numbers they mentioned were considerably different from what you've just described." Dale's smile went very still. "Well, now those would be general figures. They were specific figures," Beatrice said, "reference to this county this season, and they were higher than your current contract with Mr. Whitaker, let alone what you're proposing now." Roy Ferris, who had not said a word since sitting down, put his cup down and looked at his brother. "Dale," he said, "just the one word." Dale cleared his throat. He looked at Caleb, and for the first time the practiced warmth in his face showed a seam. "Caleb," he said, with the injured dignity of a man who has been caught and is reframing it as a misunderstanding. "I don't know where Mrs. Holloway is getting her information, but—" "Is she wrong?" Caleb said. Silence. "Is she wrong, Dale?" Caleb said again, and his voice was quiet and without heat, which was somehow more final than anger would have been. Dale Ferris looked at his brother. Roy gave him nothing. Dale looked back at his coffee cup. Some of the performance went out of his shoulders. "The market did soften," he said more carefully now, "but maybe not as much as I indicated." "Maybe not at all," Beatrice said. "There's overhead costs." "There are always overhead costs," Beatrice said. "There are overhead costs on this end too, Mr. Ferris. The question is whether you would like to continue a business relationship with this ranch at a fair price, or whether Mr. Whitaker should take his cattle to market himself and deal with the Hendersons directly." Dale Ferris looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him and said nothing. "The Hendersons," Dale said, and the ease had fully gone out of his voice now. "I understand they're buying this fall," Beatrice said, "and paying fair market." Another silence, this one longer and less comfortable than the last. Roy Ferris leaned toward his brother and said something low enough that Beatrice couldn't catch it. Dale straightened in his chair. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, set it down. "All right," he said finally. "We'll honor the original contract price. With a 5% increase for the fall delivery," Beatrice said. "Now wait just a—" "For the inconvenience," Beatrice said. "And in recognition of a long business relationship that I'm sure you'd like to continue." Roy Ferris made a sound that might have been a laugh if he had allowed it to go all the way. He turned it into a cough. Dale looked at Caleb one more time with the expression of a man who had come to a meeting expecting to shear a lamb and had found something with considerably more intention. 5%, he said. 5%, Beatrice agreed. Dale Ferris stood up, put on his hat, and extended his hand to Caleb. "Good doing business with you, Caleb," he said with the residual dignity of a man who is choosing to pretend this had gone differently. He looked at Beatrice. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Ferris," she said pleasantly. Roy Ferris nodded at her on his way out. It was a small nod, but it was genuine, and she filed it away. The wagon pulled out of the yard. Beatrice turned back to the counter and picked up her coffee cup. Caleb was looking at her. "The Hendersons," he said. "What about them? Are they actually buying this fall?" She took a sip. "I have absolutely no idea." I was quiet for a moment. Then a sound came out of him low and abrupt, and startled. That was the first real laugh she had heard from him. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then he pressed his mouth together and looked away. But it had been there fully and completely, and the kitchen felt different after it. Warmer. Less like a place where someone had merely been surviving, and more like a place where someone was beginning to live. "Beatrice," he said. "Caleb, where did you learn to do that?" She rinsed her cup in the basin. 30 years of doing business with men who assumed I didn't understand the numbers," she said. "You learn." The town found out about the Ferris negotiation within a week, the way things found out about themselves in Red Hollow, through the particular alchemy of small-town proximity and insufficient discretion. Roy Ferris. It turned out had told the story to 2 men at the saloon that same evening, and he had told it with something close to admiration, which made it travel faster than if he had told it with contempt. By Sunday, 3 different people had asked Caleb about the woman managing his ranch. He told them all the same thing. "She's the best thing that's happened to this place in years." He said it plainly, the way he said everything without theater or elaboration, which meant it landed harder than any embellishment would have. Beatrice did not hear this directly. She heard it the way she heard most things sideways through the reliable transmission of a small town's information network. Martha from the Trading Post told her on Tuesday, with the air of someone delivering news she thought the recipient should have. Beatrice said, "That was kind of him," and went on examining the bolts of cloth for the curtain she was replacing in the back room. Martha looked at her with the assessing expression of a woman who had been watching people for 40 years and thought she was seeing something. "He means it, you know," Martha said. "I know," Beatrice said. "Do you—" She looked up. Martha was watching her with a particular directness that was not unkind, but was not careless either. "I know he means it professionally," Beatrice said carefully. "Men," said Martha, and turned back to her own business in a way that managed to communicate quite a lot without saying another word. Beatrice paid for her goods and drove back to the ranch and did not think about what Martha meant, because she was very good at choosing what not to think about, and this was one of the things she had chosen. The trouble came on a Friday afternoon from a direction she had not been watching. She was in this kitchen when she heard hooves in the yard. Not Caleb's horse, which she knew by sound now, but something lighter and faster and not from the direction of the range. She came to the door and saw a young woman dismounting from a bay mare, and even before the woman turned around, something in Beatrice's stomach went careful and still. The woman was perhaps 30. Pretty in an arranged way, with the particular confidence of someone who had grown up believing that rooms adjusted to her when she entered them. She wore good clothes, not working clothes, clothes meant to be seen in. She looked at the ranch the way people look at things they are deciding whether to approve of. Then she saw Beatrice in the doorway and stopped. "I'm looking for Caleb Whitaker," she said. "He's on the range," Beatrice said, I expect him back around 5. The woman looked her up and down. And you are Beatrice Holloway. I manage the ranch house. Something moved across the woman's face. Ah, she said. The single syllable carried a full paragraph. Can I give him a message? Beatrice said. I'll wait, the woman said, and moved toward the porch steps with the air of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. Her name, it emerged during the next 40 minutes, was Caroline Voss. Her father owned a considerable spread 3 miles east. She had known Caleb before Clara died in the easy way that people know each other when they live in proximity, and their families have the same general elevation of circumstance. She had been widowed herself 2 years ago. She mentioned this with the practiced sadness of someone who had refined the anecdote and had been, she said, meaning to visit for some time. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of Beatrice's coffee and talked the way people talk when they want to establish something without stating it directly. She talked about the town, about mutual acquaintances, about how isolated it must be for a man to live alone so long. She talked about Clara with the careful sympathy of a woman who has thought carefully about when to deploy it. She did not address Beatrice again after the initial exchange, except once to ask for more coffee, which she requested the way you request something from furniture. Beatrice refilled the cup and went back to the bread she was making and said nothing and listened to everything. Caleb came in at 5:05. He stopped in the doorway the way he always stopped, assessing the room in a single sweep before entering it, and she watched his face when he saw Caroline Voss sitting at his kitchen table. "Caroline," he said, surprised but not unpleasantly. "Caleb." She stood up and gave him the full effect of her smile. "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry for that." He took off his hat. "It's good to see you." He looked at Beatrice. "I see you've met Beatrice." "We've had a lovely visit," Caroline said, which was a remarkable revision of the past 40 minutes. Beatrice put the bread in the oven and said, "I'll leave you two to catch up," and went to the back room to inventory the storage she had been meaning to organize, and she was very thorough about it, and she took a long time, and she did not examine what she was feeling, because she had chosen not to. Caroline Voss stayed for supper. Beatrice served it. She served it well, the way she did everything. The bread, she had made a good beef stew. The preserved peaches she had put up from the fruit she'd traded for at the market. She served it, and she ate her own portion at the far end of the table, because she understood the geometry of the situation clearly, and she was not a woman who needed geometry explained to her. Caroline talked through most of the meal. She was good at it, effortless, warm, including Caleb in every sentence in the way of a woman who had decided where she was going and was making sure he knew the direction too. She laughed at the right moments. She asked questions that were really statements turned upside down. She was, Beatrice thought, objectively very accomplished at this. Caleb answered her questions. He was not unfriendly. But Beatrice, who had spent 4 weeks learning the specific vocabulary of his silences, noticed that he kept his answers short, and that twice during the meal he looked down the table at her in the way of a man checking something he couldn't name. She did not catch his eye. After supper, Caroline helped clear the table with 2 plates and the efficiency of someone demonstrating a capability rather than actually performing one. She said her goodbyes to Caleb with the warmth of a woman planting something she intends to come back and tend, and she looked at Beatrice on her way out with an expression that was perfectly polite and contained something underneath the politeness that Beatrice recognized precisely. It was the look women gave other women they had categorized as non-competition, but were keeping an eye on just in case. Beatrice said goodnight pleasantly and closed the door. She was washing the supper dishes when Caleb came back inside. He poured himself a last cup of coffee and leaned against the counter 2 feet away from her, which was close enough that she was aware of him there, and he didn't say anything for a while, and neither did she. "She's going to come back," Beatrice said finally. "Probably," he said. "She's not a bad person," Beatrice said. "She's just very certain about what she wants." Caleb looked at the side of her face. She kept her attention on the dishes. "Beatrice," he said. "The stew came out well," she said. "The peaches I'm less sure about. They might be too sweet for your taste." "Beatrice." She stopped washing, set the dish down, turned to look at him. His eyes were steady and direct and serious in the way they were when he meant what he was about to say. "I'm not interested in Caroline Voss," he said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "That's not really my business," she said. "I'm making it your business," he said quietly. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. Her heart was doing something considerably less steady, which she noted and declined to address. "Go to bed." "Caleb," she said, "we have an early morning." He stood there for another moment. Then he set his cup down and pushed off from the counter and walked down the hall to his room. Beatrice finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She stood at the dark kitchen window for a moment, looking at nothing, feeling the shape of what had just happened, and what had almost been said, and what had been said instead. She was 57 years old. She had been left on a bench with $3. She was not the kind of woman that men like Caleb Whitaker looked at the way he had just looked at her. She was very certain of that. She went to her room. She lay down. She listened to the silence of the ranch, the distant sound of cattle, the creak of the house, settling the sound of Montana, doing what Montana did at night. And she told herself firmly and practically that she had misread the moment, that he was a decent man who did not want her to feel displaced, that it was nothing more than that. She was almost asleep when she heard him. I was in the kitchen. She could hear the quiet movement of him in there, not doing anything particular, just the soft sound of a man who couldn't sleep, walking in the room that had begun to smell like someone's home again. She listened to it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and breathed deliberately, and told herself she was not going to think about this. She thought about it for another 2 hours. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days after Caroline Voss's visit. It came in with the weekly post, and Martha from the trading post handed it to Beatrice directly with the careful expression of someone who had read the return address and was not sure how the recipient was going to respond. Beatrice looked at the handwriting on the front. She knew it. She had known it since she watched it form itself, letter by careful letter, on a child's first reader 30 years ago. Lydia Ashford, Portland, Oregon. She put it in her coat pocket and drove back to the ranch and put away the provisions and started supper, and did not open it until the kitchen was clean and the bread was cooling and Caleb had gone out to the evening feed, and she was alone in the kitchen with the lamp lit and the letter on the table in front of her. She opened it. It was not long. Lydia had never been a woman who used more words than necessary. "Mama, I want you to know that I have given our situation a great deal of thought. Gerald and I have worked hard to build a respectable life here, and I cannot allow that to be disrupted by arrangements or situations that might reflect poorly on us. I have heard from people who passed through Red Hollow that you are living at the home of a man who is not your relation. I trust you understand what that looks like. Whatever you believe you are doing, I would ask you to consider whether your choices are a reflection of the values you raised me with. I ask this out of concern for both of us." Beatrice read it once. Then she set it flat on the table and pressed her hands on either side of it and looked at it for a long time. "A reflection of the values you raised me with." She had raised her daughter to be honest. She had raised her daughter to work hard. She had raised her daughter to look at a person who was struggling and ask what they needed. She had raised her to stand up straight when the world pressed down. She thought about the bench outside the trading post, the coins counted out into her palm. "This is your stop, Mama. I left some coins in the bag, the wagon going away, the dust closing over it, the whole town walking past without stopping." She thought about Caleb Whitaker walking out of a trading post and looking at her directly and saying, "I'm sorry," without wanting anything for it. She folded the letter along its original creases and set it aside. She was not going to weep over it. She had known Lydia long enough to understand that this letter was not concern. Concern was what Lydia had worn when Beatrice was still useful to her. What this was, this careful composition of shame and respectability. This was management. Her daughter was managing her from Portland, Oregon, the way you manage something you want to keep contained. The door opened, and Caleb came in from the feed bringing the evening air with him. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He looked at the folded letter on the table. "Beatrice." She picked the letter up and put it in her pocket. Supper will be ready in 10 minutes, she said. Go wash up. He did not move. Was that from Lydia? She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the lamplight on his face, and he was watching her with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to wait as long as it takes. She said nothing for a long moment. Yes, she said. What did she say? She turned back to the stove. Nothing that changes anything. Beatrice. Caleb. She kept her voice even controlled, contained in the way she had kept herself all her life. I'm fine. I have been managing difficult correspondence my entire adult life. I don't need you to. I know you don't need me to, he said. His voice was quiet, and he had not moved from the doorway. I'm not asking what you need. I'm asking what she said. The distinction stopped her. She stood at the stove with her back to him, and she breathed once carefully through her nose. She heard I was living here, Beatrice said. She's concerned about how it reflects on her. The silence behind her was so complete that she could hear the lamp flame. Then Caleb said in the quietest and most controlled voice she had ever heard from him, "That woman left you on a bench with $3. I know. And she's writing to you about reflections." Yes, Beatrice. He had moved. She could tell by the sound of him that he was closer now, 2 feet behind her, instead of 12. Turn around. She turned around. He was close enough that she could see the muscle in his jaw working, and his eyes were not quiet the way they usually were. There was something in them she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, though there was anger underneath it. Something older and more deliberate than anger. You are the hardest working, most capable person on this ranch, he said. You have turned this place around in 4 weeks. You stood up in front of Dale Ferris and got this ranch 5% more than it was owed. You have kept your word every single day since you walked through that door. He stopped. And you are worth more than anything that woman wrote in that letter. Do you hear me? She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands at her sides were very still. I hear you, she said. Do you believe me? The question hung in the warm kitchen air between them. She wanted to say yes. She understood the shape of yes, the right and grateful thing that a person said when another person had just offered them something generous. I'm working on it, she said. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has registered an answer and accepts its honesty even when he doesn't like it. That's fair, he said. He went to wash up. She turned back to the stove. The pot was simmering. The bread had cooled to the right temperature. The kitchen was warm and lit and smelled like something real. She had been left on a bench with $3.14 and no plan. And now there was this strange, difficult, unexpected thing that was becoming her life, built out of nothing but work and honesty, and the willingness of one quiet cowboy to look directly at her when the entire town had decided she was not worth seeing. She did not know what to call it yet. She was not sure she needed to. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and called him for supper, and when he sat across from her at the table, they ate together. In the easy silence that she had come to understand was not emptiness, but something much more valuable. The silence of 2 people who no longer needed to fill the space between them with words they didn't mean. Outside, the Montana night was settling in, and inside this small, struggling, increasingly alive ranch, something was growing that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them was quite ready to name. Caroline Voss came back on Saturday. She did not send word ahead. She simply arrived the way people do when they are confident enough in their welcome to assume it. Beatrice heard the horse in the yard and looked out and felt something settle in her jaw that she did not allow to become an expression. She opened the door before Caroline could knock. Mr. Whitaker is on the North Range this morning, Beatrice said. I don't expect him back until noon. Caroline smiled. It was a good smile, practiced but not insincere, which made it harder to object to. Then I'll visit with you, she said, and came up the porch steps as if that had always been the plan. Beatrice stepped back and let her in. Caroline sat at the kitchen table with her gloves folded neatly in her lap and looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of a woman taking inventory. Beatrice could see her registering the mended curtains, the herb bundles drying near the window, the clean floor, the order of it. "You've done quite a lot with the place," Caroline said. "It needed work," Beatrice said, and set water on to boil. "Caleb never was much for housekeeping." Caroline said it with the fond familiarity of someone establishing a history. Clara used to say he'd live in a barn if someone didn't intervene. Beatrice said nothing. She found the tin of coffee. "You knew Clara," she said. "We were close, yes. Before." Caroline's voice softened on the word before, in the careful way of someone who has learned when to deploy grief. "It was very hard on Caleb. He closed himself off entirely. It worried all of us." "I imagine it did," Beatrice said. "He needs someone who understands this life," Caroline continued. "The ranch, the work, the particular loneliness of it. Someone who comes from the same world." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was still warm, but something under it had sharpened by one precise degree. "You're not from here, are you, Mrs. Holloway?" "I'm from Missouri originally," Beatrice said, "though I've lived in several places since." "And your family? Do you have people nearby?" She said it gently. She said it the way you say something when you already know the answer and want to see what the other person does with the question. Beatrice turned from the stove and looked at Caroline Voss directly. "I don't," she said. "No." Caroline held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment, Beatrice saw it not cruelty, because Caroline Voss was not a cruel woman. Something colder than cruelty, and harder to argue against. Certainty. The absolute bedrock certainty of a woman who had looked at the situation and concluded that she understood it completely. "It must be very difficult," Caroline said, "to be in your position. No family nearby starting over it." She stopped herself with the grace of someone who knows exactly when to stop. "At my age," Beatrice said. Caroline's smile didn't waver. "I was going to say in unfamiliar territory." "Of course you were," Beatrice said pleasantly, and poured the coffee. Caleb came in at 11:30, earlier than expected, and he stopped in the doorway and read the room in the way he always did, and Beatrice watched his eyes move from Caroline to her and back again with the quiet attention of a man who had learned to read weather in a single glance. "Caroline," he said. "I hope you don't mind," Caroline said, and rose from her chair with the grace of a woman entirely certain she was not minding anything. "I wanted to speak with you about the harvest social next month. My father is hosting it this year, and he very much hopes you'll come." "That's kind of him," Caleb said. He had not moved from the doorway. "I'll think on it. He's also hoping." Caroline glanced at Beatrice with a smile that included her and excluded her simultaneously. "That you might come alone. It's a smaller gathering this year. Family and close neighbors." The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. Beatrice picked up a dish and began drying it. "I'll think on it," Caleb said again in exactly the same tone as the first time, which was not agreement, and was not refusal, but was the kind of steady repetition that closed a door without slamming it. Caroline left 20 minutes later with the poised cheerfulness of a woman who had decided to interpret ambiguity as encouragement. Beatrice watched her ride out of the yard from the kitchen window and said nothing. Caleb came and stood beside her. "She asked you about your family," he said. It was not a question. He had read it somewhere in the room without being told. "She was making conversation," Beatrice said. "Beatrice." "She's not wrong that I'm alone here," Beatrice said, setting the dish down. "That's just a fact." "It's not a fact I want used against you." She turned to look at him. He was standing close, not inappropriately, just close with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and his eyes holding that quality that she had started to recognize as the specific look he had when he was about to say something he had been keeping to himself. "Caleb," she said carefully. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't say something because you feel responsible for me." The expression on his face shifted. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think you're a decent man who doesn't want a woman in his house to feel poorly treated," she said. "And I think you should let me take care of myself." "I know you can take care of yourself," he said. "I've watched you take care of this entire ranch." He stopped. Then, "I'm not saying what I'm about to say because I feel responsible for you." The kitchen was very quiet. "Then what are you saying it for?" she said. He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But it isn't that." She held his gaze. Then she looked away, first, which was unusual, and picked up another dish, and he let it go, which was also unusual. And they finished the morning in the practical silence of two people who had just said more than either of them intended. The gossip arrived in town the following week wearing a new coat. It was no longer the manageable whisper about a woman living at a bachelor's ranch. It had grown the way things grow in small towns when they have been left unattended sideways and into new territory. What Beatrice heard through Martha's careful and slightly apologetic relaying of it at the trading post on Tuesday was this: that Mrs. Holloway had inserted herself into ranch business. She had no right to interfere with that. She had manipulated Caleb Whitaker while he was in a vulnerable state of grief, and that the situation at the Whitaker ranch was not a working arrangement at all, but something considerably less respectable. She heard it while she was examining a bolt of cloth. Her hand went still on the fabric. Source. But her eyes moved briefly and involuntarily to the left, toward the far end of the counter, where a woman Beatrice recognized as a close friend of Caroline Voss was making a careful study of a display of buttons. Beatrice set the cloth down. She looked at the woman by the buttons. The woman felt the look and kept her eyes on the buttons with great concentration. Beatrice picked up her goods. She paid Martha. She walked to the door. Then she stopped. She turned around. She walked back to the counter, set her goods down, and looked at the button woman directly. "I understand there are stories going around about me," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I want you to know that I'm aware of them, and I know where they're coming from, and I think the person spreading them is wasting energy that could be better spent." The woman's chin came up. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you do," Beatrice said pleasantly. "Good day." She picked up her goods and left. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were steady, and by the time she reached the wagon, they had steadied all the way. She drove back to the ranch. She was calm. She was practiced at being calm. She had spent 57 years learning the discipline of remaining functional when the world was deciding to be unreasonable, and she applied that discipline now the same way she applied it to everything methodically, without drama, one breath at a time. What she did not expect was Caleb, who was waiting at this gate when she pulled in, which was not where he usually was at this hour, and his face when he came to take the horse told her that he had heard before she had. "You know," she said. "Roy Ferris came by this morning," he said. "He thought I should hear it from someone who wasn't enjoying the telling of it." She climbed down. "What exactly is being said?" he told her. He told her plainly, and without softening it, which she appreciated, because she had spent enough of her life being protected from information by men who thought that kindness meant keeping women uninformed. When he finished, she stood very still for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that was not all right at all. "Beatrice, they're saying—" "I know what they're saying." "It's not true." "I know it's not true." "Then why are you—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "You're not angry." "I'm very angry," she said. "I'm just not performing it in the front yard." He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression that she hadn't seen before, something that crossed the line from steady and controlled into something rawer than that. "I'm going into town," he said. "Caleb, someone is deliberately destroying your reputation in this community," he said, "and they are doing it because of me, because you are associated with me, and I am not going to stand in my front yard and call that all right." "What are you going to do?" she said. "You can't unsay gossip." "No," he said, "but I can say something true loud enough that it gives the gossip some competition." She stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going into town," he said, and the tone of it was final in the way that his voice got final when the discussion was over. She grabbed his arm. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his arm, looked up at her face. "Don't do anything that makes this worse," she said. "I won't make it worse." "Caleb, think before you walk in there angry." He looked at her hand on his arm. He took a breath, a long, deliberate one. Some of the hard edge in his jaw eased by 1 degree. "I'm not going in angry," he said. I'm going in clear. She held his gaze. Then slowly she let go of his arm. He went. She did not know what he said in town that afternoon. She found out in pieces over the following 2 days through Martha and through Roy Ferris's wife Ellen, who came by the ranch on Thursday with a basket of preserves and the air of a woman on an intelligence mission that she was also genuinely trying to make kind. What Caleb had apparently done was walk into the saloon, where the particular current of the gossip had been running strongest, and say the following things in a voice that did not require the room to quiet for people to hear him. That Beatrice Holloway was the most capable person who had ever managed his ranch and the most honest. That any suggestion to the contrary was a lie, and he would appreciate it if people would have the decency to own that. That any man who had questions about the arrangement at the Whitaker Ranch was welcome to come ask him directly, and he would answer them, and he would remember who had needed to ask. That last part, Ellen Ferris reported with considerable satisfaction, had produced a very specific quality of silence. Beatrice listened to all of it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee, and she listened, and when Ellen finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He didn't need to do that, she said. No, Ellen agreed. He didn't need to. That's the thing about it. After Ellen left, Beatrice sat alone in the kitchen for a while. She was thinking about the ledger, about the Ferris negotiation, about the box with Clara's glove, about the morning she had made cornbread from the last of the cornmeal, and he had looked at the plate with that expression she hadn't known what to do with. About 3 weeks of small accumulating things that she had filed carefully away in the part of her mind reserved for things she was not going to think about. She thought about all of it now. Then she put it back where it had been and went to start supper because Caleb would be in from the range in an hour, and regardless of everything else in the world, the man needed to eat. He came in at 6. He washed up. He sat down. She put the food in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate in the familiar silence, and she waited until he had finished the main of it before she said anything. Ellen Ferris came by, she said. He looked up. She told me what you said at the saloon. He picked up his coffee, said nothing. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know I didn't have to. It might make things harder, not easier. People don't like being called liars. Some of them are liars, he said. I find it useful to be accurate. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that absolute steadiness that she had come to understand was not stubbornness or blankness, but something more deliberate. The look of a man who had decided what he believed and was not interested in being argued out of it. Why? She said. Why what? Why does it matter to you professionally? The arrangement stands either way. Your reputation in this town was fine before I arrived. It would recover if I left. She kept her voice even. Clinical. The voice she used when she needed to say something clearly without letting it cost her. Why does my reputation specifically matter to you enough to walk into a saloon and make enemies over it? The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb set his coffee cup down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at her with the expression of a man who has been asked the question he has been asking himself and has not quite finished answering it. You know why, he said. I want to hear you say it. Beatrice. Say it, Caleb. He looked at her directly in the way he had looked at her the first evening outside the trading post, without pity, without performance, without anything she needed to defend herself against. Because it matters to me what happens to you, he said. Not because you work here, because it matters to me, because you matter to me. He stopped. Is that plain enough? The silence stretched. Her hands were very still in her lap. I'm 57 years old, she said. I know how old you are. I was left on a bench. I know where you were left. Caleb. She stopped. Started again. Her voice for the first time since she had sat down at this table was not entirely controlled. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. I spent 30 years being necessary to people who didn't particularly value me, and I'm very good at being needed and very bad at... She stopped again. At what? He said quietly. At believing that something else is possible, she said. At my age, in my situation, after everything. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to believe it all at once." He looked at his hands on the table. "I lost Clara in 4 days. 4 days. And I spent 4 years telling myself that surviving was enough." He looked back up at her. "Then you walked out of that trading post, and into my wagon, and inside of a month, you made this place feel like somewhere worth coming home to." He paused. "I'm not telling you what to feel. I'm telling you what's true for me." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Give me time." "I've got plenty of that," he said. She needed the time and she used it, and the world meanwhile did not hold still and wait for her. The following Tuesday, Red Hollow saw the arrival of a man named Gerald Voss. No relation to Caroline, despite the shared surname, who had come from the east with a land surveyor and a document case, and the air of someone who already knew how things were going to go. He took a room at Calhoun's boarding house and began having conversations with various property owners in the county. Conversations that were described to Roy Ferris as friendly, and described by Roy Ferris to Caleb as deeply unfriendly once you understood what was under them. Gerald Voss, it emerged over the following days, represented a development company out of St. Louis that had been quietly acquiring land titles across 3 Montana counties. They were not buying outright, not at first. They were finding irregularities. Old deeds, disputed boundaries, filing errors from the years when the territory was still sorting out its own paperwork. They were finding these irregularities, and they were using them to renegotiate terms with landowners who did not have the resources or the legal knowledge to push back. 3 ranchers in this county had already signed over portions of their property at deeply unfavorable rates. Caleb told her 2 evenings after Roy had brought him the news. He told her at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of them, because everything important had started happening at this kitchen table over the past 2 months. "He's coming here," Caleb said. "Roy says he's working through the county systematically." "When?" "End of the week, probably." She looked at the ledger, at the deed paperwork he had pulled from the back room spread out next to it. "What's your filing situation?" "My father filed the original deed in 61, he said. When he died and the property came to me, I refiled in 71. But the original boundary survey is—" He moved a paper. "It's based on a creek line that shifted in the flood of 68. The western boundary is off." She looked at the survey map. She had learned to read survey maps in Missouri out of sheer necessity when a neighboring farm had tried to push their fence line east, and she had needed to prove they were wrong. She traced the western boundary with one finger. "By how much?" she said. "Maybe 30 yards. "And what's on the western edge?" "The best water access on the property," he said flatly. "The creek-fed section. It's where I run the main herd through summer." She understood immediately. 30 yards on paper, an entire way of running the ranch in practice. "He'll know," she said. "He'll have surveyed before he comes." Caleb agreed. "He'll walk in here with it already mapped out and an offer already written." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. "Do you have anyone in Red Hollow who can read a deed filing?" "The closest thing to a lawyer in this county is Ed Marsh, and Ed Marsh went to school with Dale Ferris." She looked up. "Is that a problem?" "Dale Ferris is the one who sold information about struggling ranches to the development company," Caleb said. His voice was very flat and very controlled. "Roy told me this evening. Dale's been taking a finder's fee." The kitchen went completely still. "Dale Ferris," she said. "Yes." She sat back in her chair. She thought about the negotiation at this table 2 months ago. About the careful performance of friendship, and the price that had been too low, and the Hendersons she had invented, and the 5% that Dale Ferris had agreed to, with the expression of a man who was recalculating which direction his advantages lay. She thought about the fact that Dale Ferris had looked at her that day and made a decision, and part of that decision had apparently been to add Caleb's name to a list. "How long has this been going on?" she said. "Roy thinks at least a year." "And Roy is—" "Done with it," Caleb said. "He didn't know the full picture until recently. He's angry." He paused. "He wants to help." She looked at the deed papers. She turned the survey map 90 degrees and looked at it from another direction. "The boundary error isn't necessarily fatal," she said slowly. If it was a pre-existing geographic shift, the creek moving in the flood, and the original filing reflects the creek line. As it was at the time of filing, then the deed recorded what was accurate at the moment of recording. You can't be held to a boundary that the land itself changed. Caleb looked at her. Can you prove that? Not by myself, she said. You'd need someone who knows how Montana territorial land law treats natural boundary shifts. And you'd need the original 1861 filing to compare against the current survey. She paused. Do you have the 1861 filing? He was already getting up. He came back 3 minutes later with a wooden box from the back room, a different box from Clara's older battered, and he opened it on the table, and there under a stack of old correspondence was his father's original deed filing. She pulled the lamp closer. She read it carefully. Read it again. Traced the boundary description with her finger matching it against the survey map. Then she looked up. Your father's deed describes the boundary as following the line of the creek, she said. The creek, not a fixed measurement. Whoever drafted this was smarter than they looked because they didn't give a yard measurement that could be contested. They gave a natural feature. Caleb leaned across the table. Which means the boundary follows wherever the creek is, she said. If the creek shifted, the boundary shifted with it. Your property line goes where your water goes. She pressed her finger on the map. Gerald Voss doesn't have a case. He has a survey of a creek that moved and a deed that says the boundary follows the creek, and those two things together mean he has nothing. The silence in the kitchen was different from all the silences before it. Then Caleb said, You read that in 20 minutes. I've been reading deeds since I was 40, she said. You get good at things you do out of necessity. He looked at her. In the lamplight, with the papers spread between them, and the whole weight of the thread against his ranch sitting on the table, and the solution sitting right there beside it. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more specific than either of those. Beatrice, he said. Don't, she said softly. I haven't said anything yet. You don't have to. She began gathering the papers into order, the old deed, the survey map, the ledger. We need to make a copy of that original filing before the end of the week. And we need Roy Ferris and anyone else Dale has been feeding to that company to be willing to say so publicly. She stacked the papers neatly. If Gerald Voss walks in here on Friday, I want everything already answered. Caleb watched her organize the papers with the same hands that had organized his kitchen and his pantry and his accounts and his negotiation with his cattle buyers, and something in his face was very still and very full at the same time. All right, he said. She looked up at him. Get some sleep, she said. We have a lot of work before Friday. He stood. He picked up his hat from the hook. Then he stopped with his back to her. I know you asked me to give you time, he said. She waited. I just want you to know, he said, that it's not patience for me. It's not me waiting until you come around. He turned slightly, not quite facing her, speaking to the middle distance between them. It's me being here, that's all. Just being here. She sat very still at the table with his father's deed in her hands. I know, she said. That's the part that's the hardest to argue with. He put his hat on and went to bed. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after, with the lamp and the papers and the sound of Montana at night, thinking about a man who had walked out of a trading post and looked at her directly when the whole world had been choosing not to, and thinking about 30 yards of creek-fed land that a company from St. Louis thought they were going to take, and thinking about Friday. She was thinking about all of it. She was building something in her mind, the way she built everything methodically, practically, piece by fitted piece. And by the time she finally went to bed, it was nearly midnight, and she had the outline of a plan that had teeth in it. Friday was going to be a very interesting day. Gerald Voss arrived on Thursday. Not Friday the way they had expected. Thursday, a full day early, which told Beatrice everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. The kind who changed the terms of his own arrival to see what he caught people doing when they weren't ready. She was alone in the kitchen when she heard the horse. Caleb was on the North Range. Roy Ferris was not due until morning. The copy of the original deed filing, which she had spent 2 evenings transcribing in her clearest hand, was on the table in front of her, next to the survey map, and her own written notes, comparing the boundary descriptions line by line. She heard the boot on the porch step, and she did not move any of it. She opened the door before he knocked. Gerald Voss was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a face that had been arranged over many years into an expression of professional pleasantness. He wore good clothes, not ostentatiously good, carefully, good the clothes of a man who had learned that the right level of prosperity read as trustworthy. He carried a leather document case under his arm. He had the surveyor's map rolled and visible at the top of it. He looked at her and recalibrated in the quarter-second way of a man who had expected to find a rancher and found something else. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for Caleb Whitaker." "He's expected within the hour," Beatrice said. "I'm Beatrice Holloway. I manage the ranch." She stepped back. "Come in, Mr. Voss. The coffee's on." He came in. He saw the papers on the table, and she watched his eyes move across them quickly, professionally. The eyes of a man cataloging what he saw, and she watched him decide not to react to what he had seen, which told her he had recognized the deed document. He sat down. She poured the coffee and sat across from him. "You know who I am," he said. Not a question. "I know what you're doing in this county," she said. "If that's what you mean." He smiled. It was a good smile, she noted. Well made. "I represent a development company with legitimate interests in land acquisition throughout Montana Territory. Everything we do is within the law." "I'm sure you believe that," she said. Something flickered in his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means that finding a filing error and using it to pressure a man into signing over his best water access at a fraction of its value is technically within the law," she said. "In the same way that leaving a 57-year-old woman at a trading post with $3 is technically within the law. Legal and decent are not always the same address, Mr. Voss." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers on the table again. "You've been studying the deed," he said. "I have." "Then you know there's a boundary discrepancy." "I know there's a creek that moved in a flood in 1868, she said. "And I know that the original deed filing describes the boundary as following the creek line, not a fixed measurement. Which means, wherever the creek goes, the boundary goes. Which means, your survey of the current creek position doesn't show a discrepancy. It shows a boundary." She held his gaze. "Mr. Whitaker's boundary." Gerald Voss set his coffee cup down slowly. "That's an interesting interpretation," he said. "It's the only interpretation," she said. "A deed that says following the line of the creek means exactly what it says. Courts have ruled differently on natural boundary shifts." "Courts in which jurisdiction?" she said. "Because Montana territorial land law on natural boundary features is fairly specific, and I'd be interested to know which rulings you're referencing." The kitchen was very quiet. Voss looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting furniture and found someone who had been waiting for him. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No," she said. "I'm a woman who has been reading deeds out of necessity since 1860. I find necessity as a thorough teacher." She folded her hands on the table. "Now, would you like to wait for Mr. Whitaker and have this conversation properly? Or would you like to drive back to Red Hollow and reconsider your position before he arrives?" Voss looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his document case and his hat. "I'll come back when Mr. Whitaker is present," he said. "Tomorrow at 10 would suit us," she said. "We'll have company." Something changed in his face at the word company. Just slightly. Just enough. "I'll be here at 10, he said, and left. Beatrice sat alone in the kitchen after the sound of his horse faded. Her hands on the table were completely still. Her heart was going considerably faster than still, but that was private. She got up and added 2 things to her written notes, and then went to start supper because Caleb was going to come in from the range, and he was going to need to eat before she told him what had just happened, and what was coming tomorrow. I took it better than she expected, and worse than she hoped. The better part was that he did not panic and did not rage, which she had prepared herself for and which would have been understandable. The worse part was the look on his face when she described Voss sitting at this table, the practiced pleasantness of him, the document case with the surveyor's map visible at the top. The look of a man who had worked this land for 15 years and was only now understanding the full shape of what had been building against him. "How long has he been in the county?" Caleb said. "Roy thinks he arrived 3 weeks ago," she said. "He's already gotten signatures from 3 ranchers." "Which 3?" she told him. He closed his eyes briefly. 2 of the names she could tell he had not expected. "They didn't know what they were signing," she said. "I know." He opened his eyes. "What time is Roy coming?" 8. "I need an hour with him before Voss arrives." "What do you need from Roy?" "I need him to confirm in writing what he told you about Dale Ferris," she said. "And I need to know if either of the other 2 ranchers who signed would be willing to say they didn't understand what they were agreeing to. If Voss's acquisition process involved any misrepresentation, and I believe it did, then those signatures are contestable." Caleb looked at her. "You're building a case." "I'm building a table to put the case on," she said. "Someone with actual legal standing would need to build the case. But if we walk into tomorrow with Roy's written statement, the original deed, my comparative analysis of the boundary language, and the names of 2 ranchers willing to say they were misled, then Gerald Voss is not going to be in a position to apply pressure to anyone in this county for quite some time." He was quiet. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. 30 years of being underestimated," she said. "You pay attention when you're underestimated. You learn everything because you know you won't get a second chance once they figure out you know it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Beatrice," he said. "Eat your supper," she said. "We have an early morning." Roy Ferris arrived at 7:55, which told her he was taking this seriously. He came in with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was equal parts anger and guilt, and he sat at the table and told her everything he knew about Dale's arrangement with the development company, and he told it steadily and without protecting his brother more than the facts required. When he finished, she said, "Would you put that in writing today before 10 o'clock?" "Yes," he said without hesitating. "Everything you just told me, specific, dates where you have them, names. I'll write it now if you give me paper." She gave him paper. While Roy wrote, Caleb wrote out to the 2 ranchers who had signed Voss's documents. He was back by 9:30 with the news that one of them, a man named Hendricks, who ran a small operation 2 miles south, was willing to come. The other had said no, and Caleb thought he was afraid, which was understandable, and not something they could fix this morning. Hendricks came with Caleb, a weathered man in his 60s, who sat at the kitchen table and turned his hat in his hands and said, "I didn't read it properly. He told me it was a boundary clarification. I thought I was agreeing to a survey, not a transfer." "Would you say that to his face?" Beatrice said. Hendricks looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, just met his eyes and waited. "Yes," Hendricks said. At 9:58, Beatrice arranged the table. Original deed in the center. Her comparative analysis of the boundary language beside it. Roy's written statement to the left. Hendricks sitting at one end. Roy at the other. Caleb at her right. She sat directly across from the chair where Gerald Voss would sit. At 10 o'clock exactly, she heard a horse in the yard. Then a second one. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. "2 horses," he said. "He brought someone," she said. "That's fine." It was not entirely fine, but she did not say that. The second man was a lawyer. His name was Patterson. He introduced himself briskly, the way lawyers do when they want to establish that the professional in the room has arrived, and he was younger than Voss by 10 years, and carried his own document case, and looked at the table with its array of papers, and at the assembled people around it, and took 1 moment longer than Voss did to compose his expression. Voss sat down. Patterson remained standing to his left. "Mrs. Holloway," Voss said. His professional pleasantness was back in place, fitted more carefully than yesterday. "You mentioned company." "I did," she said. "You know Roy Ferris. This is Mr. Hendricks, who runs the Hendricks operation on the South Road. And you know Mr. Whitaker." Voss looked at Roy with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already calculated. Roy looked back at him with the flat steadiness of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Patterson put his hand on Voss's shoulder briefly, A small signal, one professional to another, and then removed it. "Mr. Whitaker," Voss said, turning to Caleb, "I think we can resolve this boundary question straightforwardly. The survey shows a discrepancy of approximately—" "The survey shows a creek," Beatrice said. Voss stopped. "The deed describes the boundary as following the creek line," she continued. "Your survey shows where the creek is. Those two documents are in agreement, not in conflict." She slid the comparative analysis across the table toward Patterson, who was the one she needed to convince, not Voss. "This is a line-by-line comparison of the boundary language in the 1861 filing and the current survey. The creek-following language appears in both the original filing and the 1871 refiling. It is unambiguous." Patterson picked it up. He read it. He was a lawyer, and lawyers are trained to read carefully and show nothing. But she watched his eyes stop in two places and knew which lines had given him pause. "The natural boundary doctrine in Montana territorial law," she said, addressing Patterson directly, because Voss was theater and Patterson was the actual problem, "has been interpreted consistently since the territorial court ruling of 1874. A deed that specifies a natural feature as the boundary marker follows that feature wherever it moves by natural cause. Flood is natural cause. The creek moved by flood in 1868. The boundary moved with it." Patterson looked up from the analysis. "You've read the 1874 ruling." "I've read a summary of it that was published in the Territorial Land Registry Circular," she said. "I'd be interested to know if you have a more recent interpretation that contradicts it." He did not answer immediately. Voss said, "Patterson, give me a moment." Patterson said, not looking at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Patterson set the analysis down. He looked at the original deed. He picked it up. He read the boundary clause twice. "Mr. Voss," he said finally, and his voice had changed in a way that Voss apparently recognized because Voss's jaw tightened. "The language in this filing does describe a natural boundary feature. Can we contest it?" Voss said. "We can file a challenge," Patterson said. "But the 1874 precedent is not in our favor, and if this goes to territorial court—" He stopped. He was looking at Roy Ferris now, and then at Hendricks, and adding things up. "If this goes to territorial court, and other matters come to light in the process." "What other matters?" Voss said carefully. Beatrice said, "Mr. Ferris has provided a written account of his brother's arrangement with your company. Mr. Hendricks has stated that he was misled about the nature of the document he signed. If a challenge is filed, and this goes to court, both of those accounts become part of the record." Voss looked at Roy. Roy met his gaze and did not look away. "Dale's involvement," Voss said slowly, "was—" "In writing," Beatrice said. "Specific. Dated." Patterson said, "Gerald." One word. Final. Voss was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table, the deed, the analysis, the written statement, the two men sitting at either end of it, the woman across from him, who had apparently been waiting for this conversation since before he rode in yesterday. He looked at Caleb. Caleb had said almost nothing since the meeting began. He had let Beatrice run it because she had built it, and she knew every angle of it, and he had sat at her right and watched with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who trusted what he had put his faith in. Now when Voss looked at him, he spoke. "We're done here," Caleb said simply. Voss looked at Patterson. Patterson closed his document case. They left. Caleb waited until the sound of hoofbeats had fully faded. Then he exhaled a long, controlled release of 4 days of tension and leaned back in his chair. Hendricks said, "That's it." "That's it," Roy said. He was looking at Beatrice. "That's it." Hendricks left an hour later with Roy, and Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with Beatrice, and the table between them was covered in papers that had just protected everything he had spent 15 years building, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Caleb said, "He's going to go after someone else." "Yes," she said. "He will. We should warn the other ranchers in the county." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "Roy can help. And if Patterson files any challenges against other properties, what happened here today is a matter of record." "You thought of all of this before he walked through the door yesterday," Caleb said. "I thought of most of it," she said. Hendrix was your contribution. He looked at her across the table, and the papers, and the lamp, and the remains of the morning's coffee, and the look on his face was something she had been building walls against for weeks and had not. She was now admitting to herself entirely succeeded in building walls against. Beatrice, he said. Caleb. No, he said with a quiet firmness that stopped her. I need you to hear this. He leaned forward. I asked you to give me time. You said you were working on it. I respected that. I still respect it. He paused. But I want you to know that what I watch you do every day in this kitchen, in this town, at this table this morning, I want you to know that it is not gratitude I feel. She was very still. Then what is it? She said. Something I haven't had in 4 years, he said. Something I stopped thinking was still available to me. She looked at him. At the honest face and the worn hands, and the man who had walked out of a trading post and said, I'm sorry without wanting anything for it, who had ridden into a saloon and said her name aloud in a room full of people who had been saying it wrong, who had sat at her right side this morning without needing to be asked, and without needing to speak, simply present, simply there. I told Lydia I was fine, she said suddenly. Not planning to say it, just saying it. He waited. In my head, she said. After she drove away, I kept telling myself I was fine, that I'd manage, that I always managed. She looked down at her hands on the table. I was terrified. I know, he said. I was sitting on that bench thinking that this was it, she said. That I had given everything I had to give, and the sum total of it was $3 and a bench in a strange town. Beatrice. And then you came out of that trading post, she said, and you looked at me like I was a person who was worth looking at. She raised her eyes to his. Do you understand what that did? Yes, he said quietly. Because you did the same thing for me. She held his gaze. 40 years ago she would not have hesitated. 20 years ago she would have argued herself out of it. 10 years ago she would have made a practical decision and called it wisdom. She was 57 years old. She had been left on a bench. She had rebuilt a ranch from the bottom up with her own 2 hands. She had stood across a table from a man with a lawyer and a document case and not moved an inch. She was done making herself smaller. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right what? All right, she said again, and something in her voice had changed, something warm and certain and entirely without apology. I'm done working on it. I know what I know. The expression on his face changed slowly, like light coming up in the morning. Not dramatic, but real, and more valuable for it. Yeah, he said. Don't make me say it twice, she said. He almost smiled. The real one all the way through, the one that changed his whole face. I wouldn't dare, he said. The afternoon was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the best afternoons are. Caleb rode out to start the warning circuit of neighboring ranches, carrying Roy's written account and the boundary analysis to share with anyone who needed it. Beatrice wrote 2 letters, one to the Territorial Land Registry Office in Helena, detailing the pattern of acquisition and the specific misrepresentation she believed had occurred, and one to a women's advocacy organization in Billings, whose address she had found in a 6-month-old newspaper she had discovered in the back room. She did not know if the letters would produce anything. She wrote them because producing something was not the only reason to write. She was sealing the second letter when she heard a horse in the yard that was not Caleb's. She went to the door. It was Dale Ferris. She had not seen Dale Ferris since the negotiation 2 months ago, since the morning she had turned 5% of his confidence in his own advantage into a line item in Caleb's ledger. He looked different now. The practiced friendliness was gone, stripped off like paint in weather. And what was underneath it was a man who was scared and trying to look like he wasn't. Mrs. Holloway, he said from the yard. He did not get down from his horse, which told her he was not planning to stay, and also that he was not entirely sure of his reception. I understand Caleb isn't here. He isn't, she said. I wanted to... He stopped. His hands tightened on the reins. I wanted to say that what I did, the arrangement with Voss's company, I didn't know it would go this far. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. What did you think it would do? She said. He had no answer. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "your brother sat at this table this morning and put what you did in writing. He did it because it was right, and because it was the only way to protect people you had put at risk." She held the door frame. "I think you should talk to Roy, and I think you should talk to the ranchers who signed those documents. I think you owe them that." Dale Ferris looked at her for a long moment. The scared thing under his face got more visible, not less. "Is Caleb going to—" He stopped again. "I don't speak for Caleb," she said. "That's a conversation you need to have with him directly." He nodded. He turned his horse. Then he stopped. "Mrs. Holloway," he said without turning back around, "I was wrong about you. When you first came, I thought—" He stopped. "I was wrong." She said nothing. He rode away. She stood in the doorway for a moment, after holding the sealed letters, feeling the particular weight of a day that had contained more than most weeks. Then she went inside and added a third letter, a short one to the county registrar, with a formal request that the Whitaker deed boundary language be formally annotated in the registry record to prevent future disputes. Small, solid, useful things. She was still working when Caleb came back at dusk. He came in and stopped at the sight of her at the table with the 3 sealed letters and the organized deed papers and the notes she had been making for the neighboring ranches. "Dale Ferris was here," she said. He was still for a moment. What did he say? That he was wrong. She stacked the letters neatly. "I told him to talk to Roy and to the ranchers." Caleb came to the table. He stood behind the chair beside her, not sitting, just standing close in the way he had been doing lately. Close enough that she was aware of him, not so close as to press anything she hadn't invited. "I went to 7 ranches today," he said. "Every one of them needed what Roy wrote. I know. 3 of them are looking at their deed language now and finding problems. I'll help them," she said. "If they want." He put his hand on the back of her chair, not on her, on the chair, but close. "Beatrice," he said. "When Lydia drove away and left you at that trading post—" "Caleb, I'm not talking about Lydia," he said. "I'm talking about what happened after." He moved around the chair and sat beside her, not across from her, beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You walked out of that trading post with $3 in a bag, and you have spent every day since then building something. Not for me. You built it because it's what you do. Because you don't know how to be in a place without making it better." She looked at the letters on the table. "I'm good at work," she said. "It's what I know." "It's not all you are," he said. She turned to look at him. He was right there, right beside her, not performing anything, just looking at her with the steady, direct attention that had stopped her in her tracks outside a trading post on an August evening and had not entirely let her go since. "I know that," she said quietly. "I'm learning to let myself know it." He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. She did not move her hand away. They sat like that in the kitchen of his small and struggling and increasingly thriving ranch, with the deed papers and the letters and the lamp between them and the Montana evening, doing what it always did outside, and neither of them said anything more, because everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that hadn't been said yet could wait for its own time. She had learned at 57 years old, sitting at this table with this man's hand over hers, that some things did not need to be rushed, that some things were worth being patient for, that the woman who had been left on a bench with $3 and no plan was still here, still working, still building, still standing. And that standing beside her now was a man who had chosen her not out of pity and not out of need, but out of something cleaner and more durable than either. Outside, the last of the evening light let go. Inside, the lamp held. The letter from Helena arrived on a Monday. Beatrice was in the kitchen when Caleb brought it in from the post, and she knew from the way he set it on the table carefully with both hands, the way you set something down that has weight, that it was not ordinary mail. The return address was the Montana Territorial Land Registry Office. She sat down. She opened it. She read it twice before she said anything. "They're opening a formal inquiry," she said, "into Voss's company, into the acquisition pattern across 3 counties. She set the letter flat on the table. "They want a representative from this county to provide a formal statement in Helena within 30 days. Caleb sat across from her. You wrote that letter 3 weeks ago. I did. You didn't tell me you expected this. I didn't expect it, she said honestly. I hoped for it. Those are different things. He looked at the letter, then at her. Who goes to Helena? She had been thinking about that since the second reading. Roy has the written account. He's the most credible witness to Dale's arrangement. Hendricks can speak to the misrepresentation on his own signing. She paused. But someone needs to present the legal analysis of the boundary language. Someone needs to walk them through the deed comparison and the 1874 precedent. You, he said. I'm not a lawyer. You out-argued one at this table. Patterson wasn't arguing, she said. He was calculating. There's a difference. She smoothed the letter with her palm. But yes, I think it should be me. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not concern exactly, more like the particular expression of a man watching someone he cares about walk towards something large and deciding whether to say so. It's 4 days to Helena by stage, he said. I know. You'd be gone the better part of 2 weeks. I know that too. He was quiet. Caleb, she said. I'm not going to tell you not to go, he said. I wouldn't do that. I know you wouldn't. He stopped. He picked up the letter, read it himself, set it back down. 2 months ago, you were sitting on a bench outside a trading post. I'm aware, she said. And now you're going to the territorial capital to make a case in front of a land registry inquiry. She looked at him. Is there a question in there? No, he said, and something in his voice was quiet and full. At the same time, the way it got sometimes when he said more with 1 word than most men said with 20. No question, just... He shook his head slightly. I'll get the ranch through 2 weeks fine. I know you will, she said. You got it through 4 years before I arrived. It wasn't the same, he said. She held his gaze. No, she said softly. It wasn't. She left on Wednesday. Roy Ferris went with her, and Hendricks sent a written affidavit because his wife was unwell and he couldn't leave. Martha from the trading post pressed a paper-wrapped parcel of food into Beatrice's hands at the stage stop and said, You come back and tell me everything, with the firmness of a woman who had decided to claim a friendship, whether or not it had been formally established. Caleb was at the stage stop too. He stood with his hat in his hands, and he did not make a speech about it, which was exactly right, because a speech would have made it harder. He said, Be careful. She said, I'm always careful. He said, That's not what I mean. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she had stopped trying to defend herself against. I know what you mean, she said. I will. He put his hat on. He stepped back. The stage pulled out. She did not look back, but she knew he was still standing there. Helena was larger than she had prepared herself for, and louder and full of the particular energy of a place that knew it was becoming something. The Territorial Inquiry Office was on the main administrative road, a solid stone building with the kind of permanence that government buildings have when they are trying to establish that they intend to stay. The inquiry officer was a man named Aldrich 50s, careful with the face of someone who had spent a career hearing people tell him things and had learned to wait for the part that mattered. He received Beatrice and Roy in a spare room with a long table and 2 clerks positioned at the sides, and he looked at Beatrice with the brief recalibration that she had grown accustomed to the look of a man who had expected a rancher and was adjusting his assumptions. She was accustomed to it. She let him adjust, and then she began. She had organized everything into a logical sequence on the stage ride over 3 days, the original deed and its boundary language, the comparative analysis, the 1874 precedent summary, Roy's written account of Dale Ferris's arrangement, and a timeline she had constructed of Voss's acquisition pattern across the 3 counties built from information Roy had gathered, and the letters that had come back to her from 2 of the other ranchers she had written to after the confrontation at the kitchen table. She presented it in order. She spoke clearly and without apology, and without the particular deference that she had spent years performing for rooms full of men who expected it. Aldrich listened. His clerks took notes. Roy added his account when she indicated him. Aldrich asked questions. Good questions, specific questions. The questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand the mechanism of what had happened, and not simply building a record for appearance's sake. At the end of 2 hours, Aldrich set down his pen and looked at her. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "how did you come to be at the Whitaker Ranch?" It was not a question she had prepared for, because it was not a question about the deed or the survey or the acquisition pattern. "I was in Red Hollow without a situation," she said carefully. "Mr. Whitaker offered me work. And you took it upon yourself to analyze his deed filing." "He showed me the ledger," she said. "The deed came with it. I read what was in front of me." Aldrich looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same county as one. "The Territorial Land Registry could use someone who reads what is in front of them," he said. She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. "We will be in contact with your county within the week," he said. "I believe we have sufficient grounds to proceed." Roy beside her exhaled. They were in Helena for 4 days, waiting for the formal confirmation of the inquiry's decision to proceed, which came on the 3rd day, and was delivered to Roy as the named county representative. On the 4th morning, while Roy was completing his final statement with Aldrich's clerks, Beatrice was sitting alone in the small room of the boarding house where they were staying writing a letter. It was not to Caleb. She had written to Caleb every evening, short practical letters about the inquiry's progress, the questions Aldrich had asked, what the next steps were likely to look like. She had written them the way she did most things, directly without excess. This letter was to Lydia. She had started it 3 times in the months since Lydia's letter had arrived. She had not finished it. She had not been ready to finish it because she had not been sure what she wanted to say, not what she should say, not what was polite or correct or measured, but what she actually wanted to say, which was a distinction she had spent 57 years learning to honor. She was ready now. She did not write it in anger. She had moved past anger somewhere between the kitchen table confrontation with Gerald Voss and the moment Caleb had put his hand over hers in the lamplight, and what was on the other side of anger was something quieter and considerably more honest. She wrote, "Lydia, I received your letter. I have thought about it a great deal. I want to tell you some things, not to hurt you and not to ask anything of you, but because I have spent too many years saying less than I meant to say. I raised you the best I could with what I had. I gave you everything I knew how to give. I do not regret any of it. Not one cold morning or one mended dress or 1 year of doing the work of 2 people so that you could have more than I did. I don't regret it, but I have spent the last 3 months building something I should have built for myself a long time ago. I have a place where my work is valued. I have people who look at me directly. I have learned that being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and I was needed for a long time without being valued, and I let that go on longer than I should have. I'm not writing to make you feel guilty. I'm writing to tell you that I am well, that I am more than well, that the woman you left at the trading post in Red Hollow is not the woman who is writing this letter, and the woman writing this letter does not need you to come back and fix anything. If you want to know me someday, the person I am now, not the one you left behind, I will be here. I am not going anywhere, but I will not be waiting. I am done waiting for people who have already decided where they are going. I wish you well. I mean that without reservation. Beatrice. She sealed it. She put it in her coat pocket. She sat for a moment with her hand over it. Then she got up and went to find Roy and tell him the stage schedule for tomorrow's return to Red Hollow. Caleb was at the gate when the stage came in. She saw him before she stepped down, standing at the side of the road with his hat pushed back the way he wore it. Hands in his coat pockets, not pacing, not performing impatience. Just there. The way he was always just there. She stepped down from the stage. He looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression she had learned to read, the one that lived underneath the steadiness, the one that said things his voice took longer to say. "How did it go?" he said. "The inquiry is proceeding," she said. "They have sufficient grounds. Voss's company is going to have a very difficult season. And you?" She picked up her bag. "I'm very tired," she said. "And I'm glad to be back." Something in his face shifted. Warm and quiet, and entirely without theater. "Good," he said. "Come home." She walked beside him to the wagon, and neither of them said anything more on the road back to the ranch, and it was the best silence she had been in for 4 days. The autumn came in fast that year, the way Montana autumn did not gradually but decisively like a door closing. The ranch was different when she returned. Not in the large ways the work was the same, the land was the same, but in the small accumulated ways that she noticed because she had learned to notice small things. Caleb had repaired the fence on the east side that he had been putting off since July. The root cellar had been reorganized in a way that was not her system, but was clearly someone's deliberate attempt at a system. The kitchen herbs had been watered while she was gone, which he had not mentioned, and she had not asked about. She mentioned it once. "You watered the herbs," she said. "They looked like they needed it," he said without looking up from the harness he was mending. She went back to her bread dough. Some things did not need more than that. The formal inquiry results came in writing 6 weeks after Helena. Voss's company was found to have engaged in a pattern of misrepresentation across 3 counties. The documents signed by Hendricks and 2 other ranchers were declared contestable. Dale Ferris was formally named as a paid informant, which meant his standing in the business community of Red Hollow shifted overnight in the permanent way of things that have been said aloud and cannot be unsaid. Roy brought the letter out to the ranch himself. He handed it to Beatrice at the kitchen door, which told her something about how the month had changed the geography of things. Caleb read it at the table. He read it the whole way through without speaking. Then he set it down and looked at the window. "Hendricks gets his land back," he said. "He gets his land back," Beatrice confirmed. Caleb was quiet for another moment. "You started this," he said, "with the letter to Helena." "Roy started it," she said, "when he decided to tell the truth about Dale. You gave him the paper to write it on." She looked at him. "Don't make me more than I am." "I'm not making you anything," he said. "I'm just saying what's true." She held his gaze. Then she looked at the letter on the table, the formal language the territory seal, the stamp of the inquiry office, and she thought about the woman who had sat on a bench in August with $3 and no plan, and who had never in her life been in a position where she had no plan. She had not needed a plan. She had needed a table, a lamp, a ledger book, and enough time to read what was in front of her. "I'm going to help the other ranchers look at their deed language," she said. "The ones who haven't been targeted yet, before Voss or anyone like him comes back." Caleb looked at her. "I figured," he said. "You don't mind." "Beatrice." He said her name the way he said it sometimes, not as a question, not as a statement, but as something complete in itself. "Why would I mind?" She turned back to the stove. "Because it will take time," she said. "And it's not—" She stopped. "It's not what you hired me for." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I want to say," he said. "Say it anyway." He pushed back from the table and came to stand behind her, not touching, just close in the way he had been doing since the evening he had put his hand over hers in the lamplight. "I didn't hire you," he said. "We made an arrangement, and then the arrangement changed into something else, and you know that it did." She turned around. He was right there the way he always was, close enough to be real, far enough to be a choice. "I know," she said. "Then stop calling it what you were hired for," he said, "and start calling it what it is." "Which is what?" she said quietly. "Your life," he said. "This is your life, this ranch, this town, these people you're helping." He looked at her steadily. "And me, if you'll have it that way." The kitchen was very still. She had spent 57 years being necessary. 30 years of it she had spent being necessary to people who had not valued her, and she had told herself that the necessity was enough, that the work was enough, that a woman like her, a plain-faced, large-bodied, capable woman, with no one in her corner, did not get to want more than that. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that had taken 57 years and $3.14 and a bench in a strange town, and one quiet cowboy who looked at her directly to make clear. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, to which part?" "All of it," she said. "Yes, to all of it." Something in his face did what it rarely did, let go of its control, Let the steadiness drop. Let her see the man underneath it, who had spent 4 years surviving, and had somehow, despite everything, not lost the capacity to feel something worth surviving toward. He reached out and took her hand. Not over it this time. In it. His fingers around hers, deliberate and unhurried the way he did everything. She held on. The town changed its mind about them in the particular way that small towns change their minds, not all at once, and not with any formal announcement, but in the accumulation of small daily revisions. Martha had changed her mind months ago, and had been quietly influencing the conversation ever since, which Beatrice suspected, and Martha had never confirmed, and they had never discussed directly, which was its own kind of friendship. Roy Ferris had changed his mind the morning he sat at her kitchen table and wrote his account out in her handwriting paper. Ellen Ferris brought preserves. Hendrik stopped by twice with produce from his garden, and once with his wife, who was recovering well, and wanted to thank the woman who had helped give them back their land. The women at the dry goods store still watched when she came in, but the watching had changed quality. It was no longer the watching of people assessing an intruder. It was something closer to the watchfulness of a community that has realized somewhat against its expectations, that someone it had underestimated is worth paying attention to. Mrs. Calhoun said good morning to her in the street one Tuesday in October. She said it stiffly, with the residual dignity of a woman who was not accustomed to being in the wrong, but had decided to behave as if she was slightly less in the wrong than she had been. Beatrice said good morning back without making anything of it, which was the kindest thing she could have done, and she knew it. Caroline Voss stopped coming to the ranch. There was no scene about it and no formal withdrawal. She simply stopped, and Beatrice did not ask, and Caleb did not explain, and the matter closed itself, the way some matters do when the people involved are too clear-eyed to pretend there is anything to say. The second letter from Lydia arrived in November. Beatrice saw the handwriting on the front and stood for a moment in the kitchen holding it. Then she sat down and opened it. This one was longer. Lydia had written 3 pages, which was more than Beatrice had received from her daughter in years. She had written about Portland, about Gerald's business, about the autumn there. She had written carefully, with the deliberate effort of a woman who was constructing something she was not sure how to build. And toward the end, after the updates about the weather and the business and the careful social notes, she had written the following. I have thought about what you said in your letter. I have thought about it more than I expected to. I don't know that I can explain why I made the choices I made in Red Hollow. I don't know that an explanation would be what you need from me. But I want you to know that I am aware of what I did. I am aware that it was wrong. Gerald has been less. Gerald has been different recently. Things are not entirely what they appeared. I don't know what I'm asking you, Mama. Maybe I'm not asking anything. Maybe I'm just telling you that I know. Lydia. Beatrice read it once. Then she read it again more slowly. She sat with it for a long time. Caleb came in from the afternoon feed and saw her at the table and stopped. Lydia, he said. Yes. He came and sat beside her, not across beside, and waited. She told him what it said. She told it plainly without making it larger or smaller than it was. When she finished, he was quiet. What do you want to do? He said. She looked at the letter. I don't know yet. That's fair. I'm not going to go rushing back, she said. I'm not going to make it easy, and I'm not going to make it impossible. She folded the letter slowly. She said she knows. That's more than I expected from her. She paused. Maybe it's a beginning. Maybe it is, he said. I'm not holding my breath, she said. No, he agreed. But you're leaving the door. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I'm leaving the door. He put his arm around her shoulder. The first time he had done that, simply and without occasion. Just because she was there, and he was there, and the kitchen was warm, and the letter was folded, and the door was being left open by a woman who had learned at 57 years old that forgiveness and welcome were not the same thing, and you were allowed to offer one without immediately offering the other. She leaned into him slightly, in the way of someone testing something they had not fully trusted yet, and finding it solid. It held. In the last week of November, Caleb asked her to stay. Not the arrangement, Not the management of the ranch house, not the ledger, or the meals, or the deed analysis, or any of the practical things they had been to each other since an August evening outside a trading post. He asked her in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, because that was where the real things happened in this house, and he knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them had needed to say so. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as hired help, not as an arrangement." He set his cup down. "As my wife, if you'll have me. As the person who decides with me what this place becomes." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking because I'm grateful. I'm not asking because I need someone to run this house. I'm asking because when I think about the next 15 years, you're in all of them, and I'd like that to be something we decide together rather than something that just happens." She held her coffee cup. She thought about the bench. She thought about $3. She thought about the first morning she had made cornbread from the last of the cornmeal, and he had looked at the plate with that expression she hadn't known what to do with. She thought about Clara's box, and the 1874 precedent, and the Ferris negotiation, and Roy's handwriting on her paper, and Helena and the herbs coming up in the south bed, and the way his hand had felt over hers in the lamplight, and the arm around her shoulders while she held Lydia's letter. She thought about all of it. Then she set her coffee cup down. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that." "I've been thinking about it for 3 months," she said. "It's not just like anything, it's very carefully considered." He almost smiled. The full one. The real one that changed his whole face, and that she had decided some weeks ago was one of her favorite things in the world, which was a sentence she would not have known how to complete in August, and could now complete without hesitation. "All right," he said. "There are conditions," she said. "Name them." "I keep the ledger," she said. "And I keep helping the neighboring ranchers with their deed language. And I write letters when I believe letters need writing. And you never once make me feel that my opinions about this ranch are a courtesy rather than a right." "Done," he said. "Done, done, done, and done. And you eat what I cook without complaint." "Beatrice," he said with great sincerity, "that one I could have agreed to in August." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she had not done in longer than she could clearly remember. She laughed. Not the almost smile of the early weeks, not the controlled warmth she had allowed herself as the months passed, but a real laugh, full and unguarded, and entirely without apology. He looked at her laughing, and his face did what it always did when she surprised him. Went quiet in the specific way of a man who is registering something he wants to remember, and then he laughed too, and the kitchen was full of it, and outside Montana was doing what November did, and inside this small and struggling, and now entirely thriving ranch. Two people who had each spent years believing that their best days were behind them were wrong in the best possible way. They married in December. Roy Ferris stood for Caleb. Martha stood for Beatrice, which had not been planned, but which felt when it happened like the most obvious thing in the world. The ceremony was small, just the people who had earned their place in this story through honesty and action, and the willingness to sit at a kitchen table when it mattered. Hendricks came with his wife, who was fully recovered, and who held Beatrice's hand afterward and said, "We wouldn't have our land if it weren't for you." And Beatrice said, "You would have found another way." And Hendricks's wife said, "Maybe. But you were the way we found," which was honest and which Beatrice accepted. Mrs. Calhoun was not there. Caroline Voss was not there. Dale Ferris was not there, though Roy had told her that Dale had gone to each of the ranchers he had wronged and said what needed saying, which was not enough, but was not nothing. After in the kitchen of what was now her home, in every sense of the word. Beatrice stood for a moment alone, while Caleb was outside with the guests, and she looked at the room, the curtains she had mended, the herbs drying near the window, the clean floor, the order and the warmth of it, and she thought about the woman who had sat on a bench in August with nothing but a cracked Bible and a worn leather bag, and the discipline not to collapse in public. She picked up the Bible from the windowsill where she had kept it since the first night. She opened it to the front page. Lydia's name written in her own hand, 30 years old, now the ink gone brown. Below it she took the pen from the kitchen shelf. She wrote Beatrice Whitaker, Red Hollow, Montana, December 1878. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the Bible and set it back on the windowsill and went outside to be with the people who had chosen her. The letter she sent to Lydia the following week was short. It contained the facts of the marriage, the address of the ranch, and the following. I am well. I am more than well. If you want to know where I am now, you know. The door is not locked, but I am not waiting beside it anymore. I have a life to be living. She meant every word. She had built this life from $3 and a bench, and the willingness of one quiet cowboy to look at her when the world had decided not to. She had built it with her own hands and her own mind, and the knowledge she had accumulated across 57 years of being underestimated and outworking the underestimation every time. She was done being a woman who waited. She was a woman who built, who organized ledgers and read deeds and stood across tables from men with lawyers and did not move, who wrote letters to territorial offices and meant them, who planted herbs in August and trusted they would grow, who looked at a struggling ranch and saw not what it was, but what it was becoming. She was a woman who had been left on a bench, and she had turned that bench into a beginning, not because life had been kind to her. It had not always been kind. Not because she had been rescued. She had not been rescued. She had been seen. By one man on one evening in one dusty Montana town, and she had done the rest herself. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Beatrice Whitaker stood in the doorway of her home in the December light of Red Hollow, Montana, with her husband's voice coming to her from somewhere across the yard, and the smell of her kitchen behind her, and the Bible with her own name written in it, sitting on the windowsill, and she was exactly and entirely, and without any remaining question, where she was supposed to be. She had not been abandoned by life. She had simply been on her way here, and she had arrived.